so interesting and so like valuable. And the fact that people have this phobia to the medium is just so infantile. I mean, of course, there's a lot of like very naive narrative arts in anime, but some of them are truly mesmerizing. Well,
Oh, absolutely. Right. I mean, anybody who fucking sits there in the 21st century and is like, animation can't be used for like any serious artistic purpose just hasn't kept up with like the last like 40 years of
exactly.
developments.
I mean, you just have to watch Grave of Fireflies once, and that's it.
Oh yeah, that movie is like the most serious interpretation of like Allied bombing that I've ever seen. It was devastating.
It's insane, true. So Matt, we're already live. I mean, people are just connecting, but just to let you know, and let me check the platforms to see if the connection and the transmission is working fine. Give me 1 second here.
Yeah, take your time.
So okay, Twitch is working perfectly. Let me check YouTube. And I don't even have to check Facebook because Facebook, everything is automatic. But you know, some of these platforms, they're very jealous with one another. Like the fact that that I'm multi-stream makes everyone mad. And I thought we were supposed to live in a free market capitalism. Like, what is this blockage between competing platforms? It's insane, no?
Well, you know, that's what I've been kind of enjoying about Twitter over the last couple of weeks, because it's kind of gone through the whole history of like bourgeois anxieties around free speech in a couple of weeks, like in a microcosm. Like first, Elon Musk is like, anything will be available. People will be able to say whatever it is that they want. Then he realizes that they're using that to advertise for his competitors, and he's like, no, can't do that. You're only allowed to advertise Twitter-based stuff on Twitter. Then there's a backlash to this, and the state intervenes, and he's like, we'll compromise somewhere in the middle. Like,
it's insane.
Beautiful. Yeah.
So Matt, my friend, first of all, thank you so much for sharing our time, your time with us. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. It's a real pleasure. We have been very close to having this conversation a couple of times, but due to scheduling conflicts, you were not in the Pill Pod, and then when I had the guys on my channel, you were not there as well. And to be honest with you, I've listened to the Pill Pod for a very, very long time. I really like some of your points of view. The way you joke, it's incredible. The way you break the monotony of the high level conversation in the Pill Pod is also super refreshing. Even if we don't completely see eye to eye in some political points of view, I think we share most of our notions about how society should function and evolve, and what should be our aims, even if we don't necessarily agree on the steps and the end result. I think we share more than we antagonize. Having said that, I think a lot of the people that will see you for the first time. So I wouldn't mind if you take a couple of minutes just to tell us a little bit about your background, about your specialization, the stuff you have been studying and researching, which I think is truly fascinating, and that will serve us as a segue to go into the conversation. So please, Matt, the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot, man. I mean, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time too. It's really great to be here and to chat with you in the audience. But just very quickly by way of background, around 2016, I was wrapping up my PhD in Toronto in Canada, and it was on voting rights and constitutionalism. Nothing really all that exciting, if I'm being honest with you. And then a little thing called Donald Trump stepped onto the world stage and completely fucked up everything that he possibly could as rapidly as conceivable. And this really made me pissed off, because I was actually with a lot of the Pill Pod guys the night the election happened. And, you know, we were doing the normal left thing of being like, well, Hillary's going to win. You know, we need to push back against neoliberal centrism and this way, that way. Yeah. And only one person, my buddy Dave, was like, Trump might actually win. And then when he did, Eric got super blackout drunk. I was depressed. We were all sitting there just smoking cigarette after cigarette. It was fucking catastrophic. But when I woke up, I really decided that what I needed to do was try to better understand the conservative tradition in order to try to push back against this more effectively. Because I realized that, like a lot of leftists, I just had never really paid all that much attention to it. You know, aside from reading the odd reactionary newspaper article every now and then and kind of chuckling inwardly to myself. So over the next couple of years, I really seriously read every conservative book I could get my hands on. And that's continued down to the present day, where I have a bunch of new things that are coming out about reactionary politics. The latest one actually just came out yesterday, Nietzsche and the Politics of Reaction, which is an essay collection edited by me. And then I have a new book that's coming out with Routledge in a couple months, The Political Right and Equality, Turning Back the Tide of Egalitarian Modernity.
That's very interesting. So if you don't mind, Of course, a lot of the people that is going to be watching this video is going to be based in Latin America, so in countries from Mexico, of course, some people in Brazil, Peru, Colombia, of course, Venezuela as well. So I think if we can, and if you don't mind, pick your brain for a little bit, because what we're seeing in Latin America, it's interesting. Like the way I see different countries in the region in different cycles of the reactionary politics and populism, it's super interesting to me, and I think it's perfect for us to use your expertise on the topic to try to dwell a little bit into the situation. So my current reading is that, in a way, Brazil just survived its own Bolsonaro, no, its own Trump. Well, they're very much interchangeable, no? But in a tropicalized way. I think even the fact that Steve Bannon was one of the key influences behind the marketing team from Bolsonaro, it creates a very direct link between Trump's reactionary politics and what happened as a reactionary politics in Latin America. But also, I think it's important for us to analyze, and I would love to have your take on this, the fact that the inability of the left to propose a viable model of government is what gave rise to figures as Bolsonaro, as some figures in Chile, as well as others that will eventually rise almost inexplicably in Mexico in the very near future. And the fact is that I also want to push the blame on the left's inability to come up with a proper project to have a technocratic progressive society model. And this is the perfect ground for this reactionary right to set its roots and take all these narratives into their domain. I don't know if you agree with the analysis.
Absolutely. Well, first things, I just want to say, Viva Mexico. Let's just get that the fuck out of the way as quickly as possible. But, I think there are two things to be said about this. One is that it's impossible to understand Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, or Orban in a context that doesn't include a serious critique of neoliberalization and the insulation of capital from democratic and left pressures. So what you started to see in the 1980s is a retreat of the socialist project around the world and a retreat of the project and aspiration for economic democracy. And what filled that in was an extremely brutal form of neoliberal capitalism that was much more militant in its use of the state and indeed international institutions in encasing capital from all of its traditional enemies. And one effect of this has been a dilution of political democracy in many countries around the world, including bourgeois democracy. Yep. And so many people very rightly felt that the political elites in their country weren't accountable to them. They weren't accountable to neoliberal economic pressures, the very wealthy. And there's a lot of evidence to back up the fact that they were entirely right in this intuition. And there's no reason that these kinds of animosities couldn't have been channeled in a far more overtly progressive direction. And in some circumstances they were, right? I mean, you could think about the Bernie Sanders campaign in the United States as something that I still look to with a lot of hope. Or you can think about Lula's response to neoliberalism through much of the early 2000s through to the mid 2010s. But none of them really catalyzed into a kind of worldwide rejection of the neoliberal order as it stood. And as a result, a lot of people turned to these reactionary figures who aped a lot of progressive sounding rhetoric in terms of being opposed to Davos, globalization, cosmopolitan elites, the Washington Consensus. But rather than actually move in a democratic direction to resolve the problems that were presented or were crystallized by neoliberalism, instead they doubled down on a lot of its worst effects and tended to invisibilize them by appeals to things like reactionary nationalist identity. So that's one thing to be said. And I do think the left bears a lot of blame for that. The other thing that I think we need to appreciate is that the left has always had a difficult time understanding the appeal of reactionary politics. Now, this isn't true of everybody. People like Adorno, for example, are profound analysts of the appeals of fascism, for example. But one of the things that really made Trumpism appealing, even to constituencies that would normally be inclined to vote for the left. And I would argue that something similar happened with Bolsonaro in Brazil. If you think about the level of upwardly mobile middle class individuals who nonetheless came from poor backgrounds who supported him, was that these reactionary positions allow you all the appeal of being a victim,
right,
with the added bonus of also thinking of yourself as a more rarefied, elevated kind of individual. Because the way that the reactionary politics orients itself is by saying that you're being victimized precisely because you belong to an esteemed elite, and that status has been taken away from you. And what we're going to do is restore you to the position that is so rightfully yours.
right.
And that will allow you to enjoy subordinating or looking down upon all the other people who rightly deserve to be kissing your ass. And that's a very appealing emotional stew. This yearning to be a victim and at the same time a superior. And that's not something the left has ever really been able to offer people, because we recognize that it's a very noxious pathology that people shouldn't give into. And also because our aspiration is, of course, for genuine equality, democracy, and fraternity.
So in that sense, I don't know if you agree with this, but, and I don't want to flirt too naively with the notion of fascism, but in a way, fascism tries to divert the attention from the structural problems of the economy leading to the suffering of the masses, and tries to find a scapegoat. And normally a racial scapegoat that they can take all the blame and just direct that negative intention and say there's an easy solution for our problems, which are not structural. We don't recognize the structural problems of capital. We just blame it on a specific race, on an intruder, somebody that came and changed the status quo of our civilization. And as soon as we get rid of them, everything was going to be back to the awesome normalness. Completely ignoring structural problems and material conditions that are actually the root of the problem and the suffering of the people. But now we are seeing, like, of course, there's micro-fascism and a lot of fascist hints in the reactionary movement, especially in Latin America. And my concern is that at the moment, of course, the rhetoric has been downgraded to the level of meme, but they're finding the scapegoats in this notion that every time a left-wing movement wins in Latin America, they say, we're going to become Venezuela. Immediately, and it's like okay, like as soon as Lula takes the presidency, we're 1 week away from becoming Venezuela. Like beaches are going to become awesome, and we're going to have an archipelago of beautiful islands and delicious arepas and food, and we're going to become Venezuela immediately, like as an art of magic. But I find this strangely and scaringly similar to the logic of fascism, of finding these individual scapegoats. Does it make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the exact same thing happened in Mexico when I was living there, because AMLO was elected, and almost every right-wing student that I had came to class being like, we're going to be Venezuela before the week is out, right? Yeah. He's going to drive the country into the ground. And of course, that's not what's happened. And everyone and nobody outside the far right expected it to. But the rhetoric can be really appealing, as you bring up, in a lot of different contexts. So in terms of how it is that we should interpret fascism, including fascism in the 21st century, I think that there are a lot of things that it offers people as a substitute to those kind of structural reforms that you were talking about. And one of them is that the left, because it's committed to materialism, has always had to engage in a project of desublimation, to say that these kinds of grand enterprises that you think you might be participating in, a lot of them are actually just various forms of fetishism. There are various forms of reification. And what we really need to do is focus on the much more practical task of trying to improve the world around us, which is going to mean building things like better roads, building things like better communities, integrating people who have not typically had a voice in society into our democratic conversations, things like that, right? And this is all very appealing and would actually make our world a better place. But fascism offers something different. It offers a vision of participating in this sublime palingenetic ultranation, and a project of national renewal that's in fact supposed to transcend the material world in certain very important ways. And the fascist intellectuals that emerged in the early 20th century to this day were very cognizant of how their doctrine would be appealing along these dimensions. One of the most important fascist intellectuals was Martin Heidegger,
Absolutely.
right? And he famously claimed that liberalism and socialism were metaphysically the same. And I know a lot of socialists would take issue with that. But what he was getting at was the idea that they're both materialist doctrines that think we should improve the world as it is now. right? And try to create better conditions for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw that as crass, venal, boring, and plebeian, fundamentally, right? Because it doesn't elevate people in the way that he saw fascism as doing. And again, this can be very appealing for large masses of people, particularly those who are attracted to a sense of being a superior person whose superiority is only being denied because there's too much democracy and too much egalitarianism in the world right now.
So can we say that Heidegger was like a mindset coach? Like he really wanted people to participate in a larger, more ambitious mindset project. I mean, of course.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I'm being very ridiculed and to making that comment, but I agree with you in the sense that the problem of the left is being trapped in this notion that if you recognize the relationship between ideological superstructures and the material basis, you have to recognize there is some power in the ideological changes.
Oh, yeah.
And recognizing and giving that ground to recognizing some power to ideological changes gives a lot of entrance to liberalism and gives a lot of grounding for liberalism to actually take hold of the left. And again, those changes are much easier in the sense that they're more superficial. I don't know if you're familiar with my position on this. I think I consider myself more of a neo-Spinozist, like hard determinism. I really think like the material condition just produces the ideological superstructure, but as a subjective interpretation of our phenomenology of the world. But I don't really think ideas change the world. I really think that the world produces new ideas. And then, of course, there's some sense of freedom and liberty in mistakes, in, of course, quantum possibility. Of course, I recognize nothing is completely 100% predetermined. It was already proved by physics. But nevertheless, I think most of our subjective interpretation of the world doesn't necessarily represent the freedom we will expect out of changing the outcome of the future. So I think we overemphasize our freedom as the tool for creating change, and we under-scrutinize and we understand the material causes that actually condition us to even understand liberty in the first place.
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's an inherently democratic quality to materialism, right? Because we all inhabit the same kind of material universe, right? Mm-hmm. And we're impacted by it in very similar ways, right? If it's a shitty day and it's raining on me and you happen to be walking next to me, then it's probably raining on you as well, right?
Right.
And that's something that can bring us together. And it's also something where we might be able to cooperate to try to come up with a shared solution to it. Idealism, on the other hand, while it certainly can have progressive connotations, tends to insist that people need to turn inwards to themselves, right, and to reflect upon their private natures. And this, of course, can very easily lead to a narcissistic sense of removal from the world. Yeah. And this narcissistic sense of removal can also very easily turn into a pronounced sense of superiority over others, which is something that fascism has always aped as well, right? Yeah. Think about people, again, like Heidegger or Vola, who talk about grand personalities or authentic personalities who have a kind of depth and seriousness to them that's only intuitable to those individuals, of course, because they're aware of their spiritual superiority to others. And they look upon the world and they see the mass of human beings who are concerned with shared material interests, and they say, what a crass thing to be worried about, right? Yeah. And that's why I don't want to say every materialism is necessarily progressive, because I think you can have things like Nietzschean materialism that aren't progressive at all. But materialism generally leans in an egalitarian direction.
I agree. And I think like most of the problems from Latin American left is that they have been over idealistic, in the sense that, I think most of identity politics it shouldn't be discussed in materialism, like in the sense that, there's a material condition that preconditions your ability to have a subjectivity. Your subjectivity is a consequence of your relationship with the material world that antecedes you, that precedes you in a way. So having this notion that my subjectivity has to be changed and adapted, it will transform the world after me, it's so egoistic, like so narcissistic, so self-centered, and so full of itself. It's a little bit crazy. But I wanted to...
Yeah, absolutely. Just to give you a good quote on that front, a lot of people have talked about the association between things like Ayn Rand in fascism, even though she presented herself as an individualist and was critical of fascist collectivism. But one of the most infamous quotes she gave that could very easily have been uttered by somebody like Mussolini, as she said, "When I die, the world disappears with me." Right? It doesn't get much more fucking egotistical than that, right? Because it implies that before you were here, there was nothing. There was no human history. There's no one who contributed anything. There's nobody who built the world upon which you depend. And after you're gone, who the fuck cares, right? There's no one that you need to be concerned with afterwards. There's nothing that you need to be concerned about in your own life because it will impact people after you're gone. All of that is a matter for lesser beings to be concerned with.
So my question here, and I think you guys scratched this conversation barely one in the pill pod. When you were having the discussion about what comes first, the individual or the collective, and I think, I remember you had this metaphysical conversation, which for me has always been very interesting. What is your notion of where does the subject comes from a liberal point of view?
Well, that's a complicated question because it really depends upon what flavor of liberalism you're talking about. In the classical liberal tradition that I'm very critical of, what you find is a notion of what C.B. Macpherson calls possessive individualism, right? This notion that we come into the world as free and equal individuals, but we do not possess comparable levels of talent or drive. And consequently, it's precisely because we come into the world as free and equal individuals that whatever hierarchical disparities that emerge as we labor are legitimate in a way that the old feudal aristocracy weren't legitimate.
As if there was no past. Yeah.
Exactly, right? And you still see people like George Will, for example, refer to this kind of possessive individualist notion of liberal hierarchicalization, where they say we all start from the same starting line.
We deserve where we are.
Exactly, and it's entirely idealist, right? Because nobody starts from the same starting line, and there are people, as we know, who have tremendous advantages and people who have tremendous disadvantages relative to others. But this is the hypothesis, right? And exactly, since you then compete with one another, if you wind up therefore becoming rich and powerful, you're entirely entitled to that in a way the feudal aristocracy wasn't, because you've proven that you deserve to be there and that you deserve to have that.
Perfect meritocracy. Perfect meritocracy.
Exactly. And a lot of Marxists have pointed out how, in many ways, the kind of psychology that emerges from this worldview can actually be even more alienating than what you found within the aristocratic universe. Because at least in a feudal aristocracy, there was this sense of noblesse obligée that the aristocrats were supposed to feel towards the poor, because they saw their station as being given to them by God, and they had a duty to care for those below them as part of the rank that they had received. And, on the part of the poor, scholastics would also teach them, look, you're just there because God has this plan for you. The poor will always be with us. There's nothing shameful in that. That's very different than when you move into the possessive individualist universe, where you're told everyone makes it or doesn't make it based entirely on their own merits. So if Elon Musk gets $250 billion, that's just because he's hot fucking shit. And if you didn't make it, that's because you're a loser, right? And you deserve to be there at the bottom. And you see this possessive individualist ethos disappear for a little while in the liberal tradition, and I think that's a good thing, but it really comes back with a fucking vengeance in the neoliberal era. And so I don't think it's a surprise at all that you see people like Donald Trump, for instance, emerge out of neoliberalism, because what's his quintessential worldview? There are losers and winners, and you better fucking make sure that you're one of the winners, because if not, you're going to be a loser.
Yeah. So I agree 100% with the analysis, and I think it's a very good diagnosis of why people are defending meritocracy and the myth of the self-made man against their best interests and against structural and material analysis. But then if this is let's say one of the points of view of how subjectivity emerges in liberalism, what's yours? Like I know you consider yourself even as if partially as a liberal. How does the subject emerge from your take on the liberal tradition?
Sure. So I'm not a possessive individualist liberal, and I reject large swaths of the classical liberal tradition, but I do align myself with the more dialectical approaches to liberal subjectivity that you see emerging with people like, say, Kant, right? Where the notion of being an individual is that you take a certain level of self-conscious remove from the fetishized world outside of you, and you recognize that any kind of sublime qualities or moral judgments you make about it come from human cognition, and they're not latent within material reality itself. right? And the reason I think this is important is because when we de-sublimate the world this way, we recognize that the natural order of things is open to material transformation and change through the exercise of human will. And more important than we also recognize that human societies are neither natural or mythological entities. They're also creations of human will, and they can be changed by human effort. And this leads very quickly to the Marxist thesis, of course, that the point of philosophy and the point of critical thinking isn't just to understand the world, but to change it, and to change it for the better, right? So in this respect, I think there is a genealogical link between a certain kind of liberalism that you see embodied by people like Kant and Hegel, and Marxism. And that's the type that I align myself with at a theoretical level. So, at a more political level, I'm also with Irving Howe and Harrington and a bunch of others in saying that, look, there are a lot of good things that bourgeois society has given us, particularly things like rights to assembly, marginal rights to political participation. And I think we can do a lot better, but it's still an achievement. Rights to religious freedom, all the kind of standard liberties, with the exception of the liberty of private property. And these are things that we would want to retain in a transition to socialism. And I don't think there's anything undialectical about that. If you read Marx's critique of the Gotha program, he is very insistent that this kind of millenarian utopian tradition that you still sometimes creep up in vulgar Marxism that says we need a radical break with what came before is entirely misguided. Any transition to socialism is going to be stamped by the features of what came before. And it should carry the best features of the old society forward in the style.
Absolutely. I think the sentence that best summarizes this, and it was in my first book, is that I want to overcome that which I deny at its highest point.
Exactly. That's a great sentence. And I couldn't have put it better myself. That would be exactly the way that I would state it.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people that are cosplaying Marxism, they are like not understanding what is the role of dialectical materialism in reality, in the sense that they're thinking ideally about the process of historical dialectical materialism, and that's for me is always very, very noisy, very hurtful. And it's strange because it's when you think about the work, with the type of work we do, and I think we share a lot of similarities in the type of intentions that we have, is that revolution is always late for somebody. There's somebody in the world which revolution always arrives a little bit too late. So are we gonna of course it has to be today. For somebody it should happen, of course, right now. But then again, it's going to survive? Is it going to be sustainable? Is going to be sustained by the right material conditions for the revolution to actually take place in the right way? Do you want revolution before you can achieve something that could only be achieved in the previous mode of production? This is hard, very complicated questions to answer. I think even Marx was resistant to reply to those questions, in the fact that he understood, like, his notion of dialectical materialism and historical materialism is that we cannot make any predictions of how communism will actually work, because ideal superstructures are only going to emerge when material conditions change. If we make any type of predictions about the ideological superstructures, we are assuming that the material conditions can be dispensed. If you can produce the ideal superstructure as a prediction, it means you don't need a material basis as a place from where the emergence of these ideological superstructures are going to emerge. So I think a lot of Marxists, they commit that type of sin of getting ahead of themselves and proposing before the material conditions actually change. And which is leading me to the next question, and is a little bit more pragmatic, Matt. And
actually, if I could just respond to that, I want to say that I think you're absolutely right in this. And some people have criticized me for this, so I'll use this as an opportunity to kind of clarify my points on this. I'm with Lenin that I do think that sometimes history does need a little push, right? And there's nothing wrong with recognizing that it needs a little push. And quite frankly, I'm very critical of liberal theorists who deny the importance of revolutionary agitation, given that the bourgeois world itself is the creation of a sequence of revolutionary agitations against the feudal order. Like the Communist Manifesto was not written about a communist revolution. It was written about the bourgeois revolutions of 1848, many of which were unsuccessful, but a few of which were successful. You wouldn't have all the good things of liberalism. Sorry, my cat wants to weigh in.
Which were praised by Marx, by the way.
Exactly, right? Without these kind of transformations. Sorry. There you go.
Mr. Fuzzy Boots is invading our interview.
Exactly. But just there's a difference between accepting this pragmatic need for revolutionary agitation and fetishizing revolution and radicalism as an end in and of itself. Because
I agree.
our end is not revolution or radicalism. Our end is
Progress.
socialism, right?
Yeah,
progress, right?
Yeah.
And revolution is a means to that end. And fetishizing revolution and radicalism for their own sake, not only I think is pragmatically
inefficient,
obtuse, it can also be dangerous if you think about the appeals of something like Sorelianism, right? And the fetishization of violence as an edifying activity for its own sake. That can very quickly lead to fascism, right? And there's a reason why many socialists transitioned away from socialism and democracy towards fascism by essentially taking this fetish of violence and transforming it into the end in and of itself.
Super interesting. So a very pragmatic question, and this is one I get a lot from the people that engage with me on social media, and is how do you, let's say, deprogram or engage with people that have been radicalized by the right-wing ideology?
Well, I want to say first off that people don't need to feel that they fucking have to. Like, as somebody who does a lot of this for a living, I can tell you that oftentimes it's pretty goddamn unpleasant. Like, there's only so many people with fucking frog icons
with Pepe,
yeah, messaging you being like, fuck you, asshole, you know what I mean, go die. Before you just kind of shake your head, you're like, yeah, all right, I mean, it got to the point, I'm not lying to you, where I could even start to be disappointed if people would send me angry emails and I didn't feel like their heart was really in it. Like I got fucking angry emails from people who would be like, you're a fucking Bene Gesserit witch, I've looked over everything that you've done, and if you say on this point here, you're a fucking idiot, you fucking tard, all that kind of stuff. And I'd be like, wow, you put real care into this. You know what I mean? Like, you've read all my stuff. You've clearly been stalking me for a few days. Like, there was effort. Other people would just like write to me being like, eat a dick, fag. And I'm like, you didn't even try.
Yeah, like, man, that was half-assing it. Yeah, you could do better.
Yeah. Like, if you're going to hate me, then hate me properly. But so, I'm not saying that anybody has to do it, because you're going to put up with that. And it's a tedious kind of activity. If you want to do it,
let's say
I think people should.
Family and friends, which are unavoidable. I think we just came out of Christmas and New Year, and a lot of people had to interact directly with their family members, which became radicalized. And most of them are retired third age people, and some of them are just meme heads. Like their view of the world is a meme. It's ridiculous, but it's becoming more and more common. Like, this currently is my favorite insult. I just like people when they write to me or they insult me on Twitter, whatever. Like, most of the time, their opinions are just memes. Like, they don't have an idea. They just have memes in their head.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like, fucking vicious meme destroys, leftist viewpoint on this and that. I've seen that all the time.
Communists with an iPhone, ooh, burned, like destroyed, owned. It's like, really?
Yeah. No, exactly. It's like political discourse at the level of Ben Shapiro, right? But yeah, sure. And in these kind of circumstances, if you're close to somebody, then I think you should use that knowledge as best you can to try to approach them in a way that they would find amenable, right? It's very, very rare that you actually argue with somebody and they change their mind because you put forward a superior argument. It's a weird thing for an intellectual to say, but it's true, especially if they are close to you. Because if you put forward a kind of adversarial argument that humiliates them, then they're going to go home and they're going to look for reasons why it is that you're wrong. So if you know somebody, try to present them an opportunity to look at things in a more nuanced and a more progressive way. That'd be the thing that I would say. In terms of people that you don't know how it is that you can change your mind, the way that I've done it has just been to try to take conservative books seriously but critically. Right. Read through them, try to understand them, sometimes better than they do. Yeah. Than they do, because a lot of conservatives don't actually read a lot of conservative literature.
Most of them, I will say.
Yeah, exactly. And sit there and be like, look, this is just what's wrong with this. And you would be surprised at how receptive people are to that, because kind of like what I was saying earlier, if you do actually read these books seriously and people are aware that you've read them seriously and you point out the mistakes, those who are not close to you might sit there and say, well, maybe he has a point or two, or maybe she has a point or two. And this isn't all that, right? But again, by no means think everyone should do that, and it's going to mean that you're going to have to read an awful lot of crappy reactionary books. So
it's insane. I had a couple of years when I was really fixated in economy, but I had to read Mises, Rothbard, Hayek. Oh my fucking god, it's insane. But like you said, you have to, because otherwise it's always like, this was refuted by Mises in like Wealth of whatever, and you're like, why? Really? And then you go and you read the books. It's like, oh my God, nobody read this. Like, nobody really read this. They just saw the memes. They just literally saw the memes and the quotes, and they took them out of context and they used them as arguments. But the issue is then again, what is the value of theory in this pragmatical political arena? Because 99% of the people are having this conversation based on a couple of quotes, some very, very funny memes, and that's it. Like, I think, but do you think it's like a ladder in the sense of like a diarrhea ladder, where you have like these really organic intellectuals that actually believe Mises and they believe Hayek and they believe Rothbard, and then they're pushing this anarcho-capitalist and this more like those are really niche. Let's be honest. Those are really niche ideologies, but they're pushing these ideologies, of course, funded by think tanks like Atlas Foundation and Heritage Foundation and Liberty Foundation. They have this insane amount of money, and they're creating these huge internet superstars promoting hegemonical point of view that justify meritocracy. And then most of the people are just taking the punchlines, the memes, and then they're using that as arguments to operate on a day-to-day basis. So it doesn't really matter if the theory is crap. What matters is that the memes they're awesome.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things that I would actually argue the right simply is better at the left than. Yeah. Now, one of the reasons it's better at the left at this is because they are very well funded in a way that we aren't, right? I mean, you can set up any crappy right-wing think tank in the United States and receive millions of dollars immediately from obscure donors, right? The Koch brothers, Peter Thiel, you name it, right? Yeah. I mean, look at fucking Curtis Yarvin. I'm doing an op-ed on him right now. Curtis Yarvin receives tons of money from Peter Thiel for writing a blog. You know what I mean?
It's crazy, man.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, having access to those kind of resources means that they're able to form essentially a pyramid of intellectuals, right? Where you have the guys at the top, and the right does have some genuinely very smart intellectuals at its beck and call. I don't want there to be any kind of doubt about that. These are people you really need to confront and understand. But what ends up happening is then there's a further layer beneath that, where these are people who will read the serious intellectuals and present their ideas to a mass audience in a way that's a little bit more digestible. And then there's a further layer below that of meme creators, content creators, interviewers, the Dave Rubin types of the world, and they'll further distribute an even more diluted version of those ideas downwards. And that's a way of achieving a kind of hegemony, right? Because you have these people who create the ideas at the top, they're disseminated downwards, and by the time it gets to, Joe Schispach on the Klan, he might have no idea where this idea came from, but he does know that it sounds interesting and that it's appealing to him, right? Yeah. We on the left, I think in part, there are a lot of reasons for this, but I'm just going to float one, especially in North America. The left broadly retreated from the more mainstream culture in the 1980s and the late 1970s under the neoliberal assault. And many leftists, including many socialist leftists, moved into the academy or into the arts, where there was space to try to still articulate and rethink these ideas. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, I'm an academic, so I'm not going to sit there and say there's nothing good at writing dense academic books on esoteric bits of Marxist theory. I love that shit, right? Yeah. But the problem is that in an academic setting, there are different things that are valued than trying to achieve hegemony in a political dispute. That includes trying to be as scholarly as possible, not really caring that much about whether these ideas are easily disseminated, privileging originality over things like cogency, accuracy, or plausibility. And also this kind of competitive ethos where leftist intellectuals often won't get along with one another because each of them is trying to be the biggest and most culturally significant fish in a very small pond, right? And none of that is healthy in the long run. What we really need to do is create something that's a little bit more like the pyramid, right? Where you have the David Harveys of the world, and I think David Harvey is very good at this, who will write dense books on Marxist theory that the average person working 60 hours a week probably won't be able to go through. But they're accessible enough that you can then have other intellectuals who explain the ideas, articulate them, and transmit them to a mass public, right? And that's a very important part of the process that we've only started to get good at again. But I think there's a lot more that could be done on that front frequently. Yeah. And I mean, I've tried to do that myself through outlets like Jacobin and others.
I'm reading this right now. I don't know if you read it.
I can't see.
It's called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Grober.
Oh, I have heard of that. No, I haven't read it. Is it any good?
Yeah, it's pretty good, man. Like I like this notion of going back and looking at political rehearsals of the past from a different angle. Like I agree in the sense that most of our notion of history is very modern. It's a pity, but modernism and rationalism, and I think the Enlightenment, it gave us a sense of superiority that then we painted with the same brush and the same color the history of all our past and all our potential future. And we're still trapped into this paradigm pretty much. Like even if we got over postmodernism, criticizing all the mistakes and lacks of modernism, our mindset is still mostly modern. Like we still think we are rational. We still think we're free. We still think science is in a league of itself. Like and from quoting Bruno Latour, we were never really modern, but we still think we are. And this for me is a very hard problem to overcome. And having this rat race of academia, in a way, still for me is a stigma of not overcoming the fact that we were really not modern.
Oh, absolutely, right. And this is the kind of thing, I think that looking at earlier periods of history really awakens you to the importance of the materialist thesis, right? I mean, anybody who sits there and says ideas make the world in a more than metaphysical sense, which is Jordan Peterson's quote from Maps of Meaning, really should go back and talk about the first person who was able to talk to the first person. Yeah, that's from Maps of Meaning. I did, yeah. Should talk to the first person who was able to control and manage fire, which apparently added an exponential amount of human intelligence and allowed us to live an additional 20 years, right? And this was probably just some guy who realized, lightning strikes, I can go put a bush in here, go and control it there. It was a very material, social kind of activity, but it was transformative for human history, right? In a way that we're only beginning to appreciate right now. Right. So I definitely think it's important to go back and look at those things.
Yeah.
I should probably do a better job of that, frankly.
No, that's what I'm really loving about the books. Like they're retelling these very old stories about what we know from originary tribes and the way they organize. And I love this notion that most of these originary tribes, they were social rehearsals in the sense that the history of social organization is a history of trial and error. And it's insane. And this notion of trial and error, of course, you can romanticize the fact that we came in contact with fire, but a lot of people got killed before we actually tamed it. Like this notion that like material events that happen into the world, given the fact that spontaneous actions can occur and produce the new, even if the new is just a product of mistake or randomization, if you want. A lot of, let's say, occurrences have to repeat themselves in order for us to be able to signify and give a meaning. And then after we can aspire to give utility and, instrumentalize that utility in the name of what we think is a moral compass of humanity. But there's a lot of trial and error in political story. And I think giving different tints and different opportunities for the past to reemerge as a thing in itself, it's super interesting. And it's very, very valuable. Not even talking about the future, talking about how we relate to our own past is very meaningful.
Oh, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think having a sense of historicity even can have a kind of democratizing effect on your way of looking at the world, because you become very cognizant of everything that you owe to the people of the past, sometimes going back hundreds of thousands of years. If you think back to, again, how important it is that people mastered fire and then passed it on to us, right? This kind of Promethean quality to it. And it kind of takes you out of yourself. And again, this narcissistic headspace that I am responsible for creating everything that I am, and alerts you to the fact that you are very much the product of not just your own local contextual environment, but a long history of people who've made some important contributions, and that can lead you to ask yourself, maybe I can make a contribution as well, right? That could be meaningful in the future.
So Matt, my friend, does the collective comes before the individual?
I would like to think that we would harmonize the two of them together, right? And the way that I usually articulate this is I think the left has been very focused on the language of things like rights and identity over the last 20 years. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that per se. And I also think that there's a lot of emancipatory potential in those grammars. But one of the things that we've sometimes struggled to articulate successfully in the last 20 years, at least in the United States and Canada, is why it is that there's a central connection between progressive radicalization and demands for freedom and emancipation, right? And the way that I usually articulate this, very much in a Marxian vein, is by saying that bourgeois freedom is important and we want those, but we also want social freedom, or Republican freedom, as it's sometimes called. The freedom to kind of have a meaningful say in the institutions and processes that dominate us, and to make them less domineering and more subject to our will. And it's important to kind of foreground this emancipatory dimension to the left-wing project, because, of course, social freedom is exactly what neoliberals try to deny, not just institutionally and structurally, but sometimes very much at the ideological level. If you think about the most insidious thing that Margaret Thatcher ever said, it was her comment that there is no alternative.
Yeah, Tina.
Yeah, exactly. Right, to what's going on right here. That is an extremely dispiriting notion that was intended precisely to preclude the idea that people have any meaningful social freedom that they can exercise to improve things. And it's what we need to absolutely reject as leftists, to give people a sense of hope for the future.
So actually, I love the comment, and I would like to include a little bit some of the questions that are popping up in the chat, because some of the comments are pretty good. I don't know if you're seeing the screen reading right now.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, you're seeing it? So there's a comment from Marta. Diego, can you talk about the role of mass media alienating people with this capitalist narrative, individualism, meritocracy, democracy, and whatnot? Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you see that very transparently at the academic level, right? Which is one where I'll just use as an example, right? So I work every day with students, right? And many of them hold progressive views, particularly on things like social issues, but they've very much internalized the meritocratic ethos that we live in a competitive society, that the most important thing is to be at the very top of it. And if you don't make it to the very top, then what's going to happen is you're going to wind up at the bottom, and the bottom is an awful place to be, because then you bear exclusive responsibility for winding up there, right? And this was bad enough in the 1980s, when we were constantly presented with these images of success and failure in things like televisual media, right? But now we are constantly bombarded with images on Twitter, on TikTok, on Instagram, of people who are framing themselves as successful, right? And presenting themselves as metrics to which we must compare ourselves. And the relentless bombardment of these continual comparators that we are never going to be able to live up to is psychologically extremely damaging, right? Now, I say that as, a millennial who just kind of got into things like Facebook and can still tune out of social media every now and then. I have no idea how fucking difficult it's got to be if I were a Zoomer, right?
Can you imagine?
And I had been online since the age of 10.
Since you were born.
Yeah, exactly. And was constantly surrounded by this influx of social pressures in order to be the number one rat in the rat race, right? It would drive me fucking mental, and I don't know how these people do it.
Yeah, it's crazy. I think there's this late comment which is also very nice. I think the fact that we were born and raised into these individualistic narratives, the hero story, the hero with 1,000 faces, everything is about overcoming, and it's about doing yourself and building yourself, and getting over obstacles, and I think that vein of narrative runs across woke ideology. So my question to you is, and to close up the conversation, because I have this and one more question that I would like to ask you, is that do you think it's probably time, or is it the right time for an anti-woke left more materially to emerge?
I don't think an anti-woke left. I think a left that's better than being woke, right? I'm going to refer back to what you said earlier, right? Something that transcends the limitations of wokeness while carrying forward its best features.
Exactly,
right? Because
its best achievements.
Exactly, right? Because there's absolutely no doubt that the socialist left through much of the 20th century was profoundly ignorant of things like gender oppression, sexual oppression, racial oppression, and the internally important dynamics that propagated those. And we were rightly criticized for being insufficiently attentive to them, both politically and rhetorically. And I think it's important to incorporate that into a broader narrative of socialist emancipation from domination and various forms of tyrannical social necessity, right? Now, saying that, I think it's very clear that woke culture and identity politics is extremely appropriable by neoliberal capitalism, sometimes in extraordinarily noxious ways, right? I mean, I saw one of the Kardashians the other day setting up, or this is a couple of months ago, setting up a GoFundMe because she wanted to become the world's first self-made female billionaire. And she received millions of donations, many from people who are extremely poor, and thought it was inspirational to try to take this woman who was already born into extraordinary affluence to take her up the next level so that she could compete in the billionaires club, right? And she was able to achieve this kind of manipulation by co-opting feminist rhetoric and putting it towards what I would consider to be fundamentally anti-feminist purposes, because I think that there's an intrinsic connection between capitalism and the perpetuation of various forms of patriarchy, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, we need to be extremely critical of woke capitalism and woke culture.
And how it can be appropriated. And I think this was pretty much like, I mean, I love the criticism that was done to Foucault as he was a very good at describing the flow of desire in capital, but he was not critical enough of capital. And this is exactly my fear, that the mindset of course is misinterpreted, no? But Foucauldian analysis, it can be instrumentalized to further fuel the intentions of neoliberalism. And I think even the theory of desterritorialization and reterritorialization from Deleuze can also be fully digested by capital, in the sense that you can deterritorialize yourself and you can even deconstruct yourself as many times as you want. That's just new work for the marketing team, and to brand you whatever they want to sell you as a new fashion, as a new flavor, as a new intention, and to recapture your desire. And in that sense, I think most of woke progressive narratives have become just marketing tropes. Nothing more, marketing tropes. Like we have this very few scarce example of overcoming the differences and the systematic abuses and injustices of the system, and they just become the new hero journey to follow. They just become the new marketing tool to sell and promote a new brand or a new product. And there's nothing else. It's the same cycle again and again. That's why I think that in a way, a probably more harsh materialist historical analysis of why we have these structural differences, it's also a residue from feudalism and early stages of capitalism. The fact that power was concentrated in white cis men, and then it's just a snowball from there. But there's no way of undoing what was done historically, unless historically we change the relationships of power and conditions. So this is no longer a problem. It's not the fact that we have to, because I think this was the analysis done by Rosie Bradotti, no? Like she's a neo-Spinozist delusion that wants to include all the subaltern narratives and bring them into the game of democracy. And it's like, oh my God, really? Like this sounds like just like new products for us to buy.
Oh, absolutely. I would even go further than you and say that this kind of emphasis on difference and particularity as a fetish for its own sake reflects the ethos of neoliberal commodification.
Exactly.
But it can very easily be appropriated for fascistic purposes. And I'm not just speaking speculatively here, right? Now, to be fair to somebody like Deleuze was one of the first people to say, I am not endorsing a rhizomatic emphasis on difference and horizontal hierarchicalization or horizontal networks. I am saying this is one form of network that might emerge in a digital era, but it's very possible to see the emergence of something like rhizomatic fascism, for example. But that didn't stop the left from making a fetish of it very quickly, right? Completely ignorant of this. And I think in the 21st century, what we've seen precisely is the emergence of something like rhizomatic fascism and the alt-right in digital spaces, where these people are very good at appropriating the language of identity politics, particularism, and demands for inclusion to try to re-legitimate reactionary enterprises. And they've even have a theoretical spokesperson in the person of Alexander Dugin, who's been very, very happy to draw heavily upon the language and theories of postmodernity and postmodern thinking in order to say, look, postmodern thinkers have proven that there is no universal moralist standpoint from which to evaluate different cultural modes of being. And that means if I want to create an anti-democratic plutocracy,
anti-liberal,
that is, exactly. refuses to accept liberal rights and engages in mass imperialist projects against its neighbors, then that's my right to do so, right? And from a purely Deleuzian or Foucauldian perspective, it's hard to say why exactly he's wrong.
Exactly.
Right? Which is why in a new collection we have coming out called Flowers for Marx, I argue that we need to relook at Marxist humanism and the kind of normative basis that you find for socialist projects in that.
That's very interesting. I'm looking forward to that. To give you a couple of closing questions, my friend, and again, thank you so much for the time. It's so nice.
No, it's been great fun. Thanks.
Yeah, I know. We have to do this again, but then talk only about movies, anime, and video games. That would be super fun. But having the closing statement. So, what do you think about this new potential multilateral political world that is emerging? Like, are we actually seeing the decay of American imperialism and potentially the rise of Chinese, whatever you want to call it, for the next few decades? I mean, not saying this next few years, I'm talking about the next few decades, but do you think we are on the brink of going to a multilateral political world?
I think that we are, right? And I look upon that with a certain degree of neutrality, right? Now, I think it's very tempting to try to overstate the case here and to argue that we're rushing very rapidly towards multipolarity and the United States is going to become just another country very quickly. And I think the events of the last year have proven that it would be naive to suppose that, right? I mean, the United States actually had a pretty good year from a geostrategic point of view. Many of its major rivals, China and the United States, either faced very serious economic hardships or in the case of Russia, saw their imperialist ventures just collapse into ignominy. And, in contrast, the United States saw the expansion of things like the NATO alliance. It seems to be economically recovering a little bit. And it saw a reset of the dollar as the world's number one currency, right, with the collapse of things like Bitcoin. So don't write the United States off yet, right? But I do think that by 2050, we're going to see the emergence of genuinely a multipolar world with China and possibly India as
players,
not necessarily antagonistic, but certainly contrary poles to American power. Do I think that's a good thing? I think that it's a good thing in the sense that challenging the hegemony of neoliberalism opens up new spaces for political contestation that weren't available before in the end of history period, right? So it's a good thing there. But it's not unambiguously a good thing. And we need to be dialectical about this because opening up new spaces for political contestation, of course, means that reactionaries and new forms of reactionary politics can emerge that can also demand geostrategic and geopolitical relevance in a way that they weren't able to do under the Washington Consensus, for example, right? And this is what Dugin and Russia tried to achieve. They failed at it, but it's by no means going to be the last effort. And I think we need to be very cautious in recognizing that replacing American global hegemony with plutocratic reactionary global hegemony or even plutocratic reactionary imperialism isn't a trade up, it's a trade down. So I'm not really sure what the future holds. I hope it'll be good, but you know what Gramsci says, right? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Yeah. There's a Spanish intellectual, I don't know if you heard of him, it's called Gustavo Bueno. You've heard of him. Like it's a complicated school of philosophy, but it's also super rich. And they have this notion of the dialectics of empires. And these empires, civilizatory empires, and these forces of civilizatory forces, and we have very few of them. And I think now that you mentioned India, it's interesting. I don't know if I will count India in for the next decade or so, because I think they haven't gone through the necessary phase as China did. But I do count China as a civilizatory force. And as a civilizatory force with all the implications, which are harsh, and of course the clash between civilizatory forces tend to lead to, like you said, a lot of reactionaries, a lot of new movements, the flirting with fascism, and of course wars, and of course live hot bellical conflicts. And as a final question, my friend, what do you think are the main watch-outs we need to be aware of this new left-wing movement in Latin America, with Boric in Chile, Petro in Colombia, Andrés Manuel in Mexico, Lula in Brazil? What do you think as let's say, cautious leftist thinkers, what should be aware of these new presidencies in Latin America?
Well, I want to say, as somebody who became politicized in part because of my father's antagonism towards Pinochet, I was really happy to see Boric and the election. And the transition away from neoliberalism in Chile, right?
In theory.
Yeah, in theory. That's what I was going to get at.
Yeah, because he's already in the cover of The Economist.
Exactly, right? Because while there was a profound transition that occurred, and it looked like people were going to vote for a new constitution, and I was very excited about that, of course, what ended up happening is there was a rejection of the progressive constitution that was put forward, I think, earlier this year, right? Yeah. And it's a shame. But what it does demonstrate, I think, isn't that Boric went too fast, because I think there's a real hunger for change on Chile's part, but that the kind of coalition that he attempted to assemble in order to advance a new progressive constitution was riven with certain fundamental instabilities and contrary sets of interests. And precisely for this reason, trying to satisfy everybody ended up meaning that he satisfied no one, right? And this is a kind of circumstance where you really need less theorists and more prudential political realists who have a good sense of what is possible and obtainable at any given moment. And I would argue that the most important thing to do when we seize power and have an opportunity to enact at least some meaningful changes is to try to transition institutions that have historically been undemocratic, particularly in the economy, towards a more democratic mode of operation, because that will benefit the left in the long run and ensure that even if we don't get everything we want in one electoral cycle or over a 4-year period, we'll be better set up to try to achieve further gains in the future.
Yeah, I agree, and I love the fact that you mentioned this attempt at rewriting the constitution in Chile, because I think it's exactly the type of thing that we have to be critical about, in the sense that I share with your regards about the potential mistakes of trying to please the wrong crowd. I wouldn't necessarily state it the same way as you did, in the sense that he tried to please everyone. Au contraire, in the sense that I think the people that need to be taken care of the most in Chile after this long period of neoliberalism are basic workers. And the constitution was aimed toward woke narratives, like including indigenism and racial minorities and sexual minorities and whatnot. And then he completely forgot about the fact that the economy is mostly built on workers. And the fact is that people are in debt and they cannot buy a place to live and they cannot afford the basic things to survive and aspire to basic dignity. And he expects to solve the material access to basic goods to aspire to a dignifying life. Saying that the problem is that we don't recognize native inhabitants of the country or people and their sexual preferences, which I think is completely misguided. And this is where I think the attempt was mostly, let's say, stained by neoliberalism.
Well, I'll make one final comment and then maybe we can end there, because this is actually a good way of circling back. I think that many leftists in developed states who weren't there on the ground expected too much of Boric. And
I agree.
I think it's because there is this expectation on the part of a lot of leftists that once you seize power, that's the main thing. And once you have it, you're not going to lose it, and you can enact any kind of changes that you want. Many of us don't understand, of course, because we've been weaned on at least a teleological rhetoric about history, that it's very possible for things to go backwards as well as forwards, right? And what you saw in Chile was a concerted effort on the part of Chilean elites, particularly the extremely wealthy in big cities, to turn back the clock on the election and to try to make sure that any kind of changes that the party was elected to bring about weren't going to be as radical as they could be and weren't going to impact their interests. And they were very successful. Like, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on counter-constitutionalism campaigns, right? And they got what they wanted. So it was good money well spent, because now it looks like there's a serious barrier on the way to reform. And you should never underestimate the capacity of elites to rally and rediscover their class interests when put under pressure.
I completely agree. And you see, like, even if this is kind of funny, but we're here like, fine-tuning our violins and like adjusting the strength of our chords and speaking about theory, which is accessible to almost nobody in the current population, and we try to make it accessible and by making these free and on the internet and whatnot. And of course we got very good questions and very good comments, but we get people commenting like, oh my god, two leftists using the honey of capitalism to promote their agenda, and it's like, oh my god. It's like, where do we even start with these people? It's insane. But then again,
I would say, George Soros needs to send us that big fact check.
I'm still expecting money. I'm still expecting, man, that money and that sponsorship from China. That would be great. I mean, if it comes anytime before the end of the month, it will be even better. But
Daddy needs a PS5.
No, I already got mine. I already finished. I finished God of War Ragnarok. I'm a happy man. I'm waiting for Final Fantasy and Diablo 4 to come in June. I'm a happy guy.
Fucking bastard. Well, yeah, it was great talking to you, buddy. We'll see you soon. Man. And thanks a lot. And I guess left is best.
Yeah, and again, Matt, if people want to follow you on your work, I know you work with Jacobin as well. You're coming up with a new book. So tell us a little bit where we can see you, where we can follow you, and your upcoming projects.
Sure, yeah. You can add me on Twitter if you're there. I'm at MattPaulProf. A lot of my stuff comes out for outlets like Jacobin. I have a new article coming out for Current Affairs soon. If people want, they can pick up my new book that's coming out soon, The Political Right and Inequality. The Political Right and Equality, Turning Back the Tide of Egalitarian Modernity with Rutledge. Should be awesome. Good.
Man, thank you so much for your time. If there's any final comment that you want to make, otherwise we can pick up next time with more easygoing subjects, but still have a politicization of aesthetics, but talking about video games and movies, if you agree.
Absolutely. Let's fucking do it.
That's awesome. So, guys, ahora sí, voy a cambiar un poquito español. Para toda la gente que estuvo acá, muchísimas gracias. Lo vieron en vivo, entonces no va a tener subtítulos. Pero después, ya que está el video en canal de YouTube, se pueden ir a configuraciones, en settings, y les genera automáticamente los subtítulos en español. Entonces, qué lástima que les estoy diciendo hasta el final. Asegúrense de seguir al buen Matt en todas sus redes sociales. Voy a dejar aquí en la descripción del video sus plataformas para que lo puedan ver y seguir. Es un gran tipo, tiene grandes ideas. Definitivamente vale la pena escucharlo y leer lo que escribe. Y nada, espero aquí sus comentarios. ¿Qué les pareció? Porque tengo un par de entrevistas más interesantes planeadas para muy pronto. Capital Humano, los quiero mucho, son altamente desechables, pero igualmente son hermosos